Hello and welcome to Meadow Afternoon. This is a place where I share writing behind the scenes and short stories inspired by slow living, historical fiction and homemaking. Today, as autumn is slowly chasing away the last of the summer, I have a new short story to share. For the project inspired by the story, I'm creating a peg doll version of my main character. Let's begin and go and meet Mrs. Prunella Trollope and her patchwork skirts. The Arrival of Autumn, a short story by Ida Williams. Mrs. Prunella Trollope closed the creaky post office door, turned the key in the latch, and gave the afternoon air an investigatory sniff. It was still quite warm, the sun sitting high up in the sky and not a cloud in sight. Pocketing the key and with a small basket under her arm, she wandered down the street towards the village square. The air was decidedly enjoyable that afternoon. Summer was lingering nicely, and she did not regret leaving her shawl at home, feeling very comfortable in her white blouse and patchwork skirt. The skirt did, however, keep her current problem utmost in her mind that day. Mrs. Prunella Trollope's patchwork skirts were an attraction of note for the village of Little Thatchbridge. Most new visitors would be informed and then eventually make the customary pilgrimage, or very occasionally have to be forcibly escorted by an insistent relation to the post office to see the marvels in person. Constructed from a multitude of different fabrics and sewn in ruffled layers, they were unusual yet carefully colour-coded to be pleasing to the eye. Mrs. Trollope had the good sense to keep to a maximum of 3 colours per skirt. Any more might drift into an untidy or even bohemian look. Little Thatchbridge may not have borne that at all well. Mrs. Trollope was regarded as a little eccentric but utterly respectable. Too many colours would have upset that careful balance. As it was, the village was quite proud of Mrs. Trollope's patchwork skirts and eagerly added them to their meagre list of attractions, along which counted the grey stone war memorial on the green and a singular half-mile stretch of Roman paved road that ran through Farmer Heap's lower field. That day, Mrs. Trollope's skirt was a mix of olive green, light yellow and a late summer straw brown. She felt right for the season that morning when dressing for the day, and it was so important to get it right. Some long-time residents found that the seasons were better predicted through the means of Mrs. Trollope's skirts than any newfangled and obviously inexperienced modern contraptions. On one well-remembered occasion, Mrs. Trollope had worn a white and grey skirt full of tiny polka dots for a week straight before the largest snowstorm that anyone had seen in living memory engulfed the village. Whether Mrs. Trollope had predicted the blizzard, or had brought it about, was up for debate, and there were a few minds on both sides. Throughout the season, she seemed to possess a skirt for every type of weather, all occasions, and every so often a new one would make an appearance. A new skirt would keep chatter going about for at least a fortnight. However, unknown to most, there was one skirt that sat in the back of Mrs. Trollope's cupboard which the village never saw. Occasionally she would take it out and wear it in her living room, admiring the light bouncing off the pieces of silk and twirling softly around whenever she felt especially sentimental for the past. But that was a past that no one in Little Thatchbridge knew anything about. Mrs. Trollope trotted neatly along. It was a sleepy Saturday, and a slight haze hung around the rooftops and assorted chimney stacks. Swallows perched on the washing lines and flitted from one peg to the other. They had not started their journey south. Yet, as Mrs. Trollope observed, they did look more restless than usual. On the green, a few children were playing, chasing each other round the ancient oak tree that sat at one end. Their shrieks and calls were the only noise that broke the calm afternoon. The mothers of the excited bunch were chatting on a bench, one knitting something misshapen and monstrously lilac. Mrs. Trollope paid careful attention to the colour and wondered if a stretch of knitted fabric would solve her ongoing problem. No, it was too chunky, not to mention the colour all wrong. As she often did, she briefly paused outside the church and peeked in through the open door. It was peaceful inside. The sunlight filtered in through the single stained glass window, and the oak pews grounded to their spots, solid and sturdy, as it should be. Mrs. Trollope did not usually see the need to visit the church outside of the Sunday service for spiritual reasons, but she did like to have a look in and make sure all was well. While she certainly had a problem that day, it seemed rather unnecessary to take it to a higher power for solving. Taking a shortcut through a small alley, she mused on her different options. A trip to town would not occur for at least another 2 weeks, and she needed the fabric before then. While the summer felt as if it would go on forever, she could feel the change coming. Autumn was steadily approaching in the shadows, with a coolness creeping in on the edge of the air. She needed something quick. The sound of the radio suddenly distracted her, and she paused by the open window of number 6. The man was singing something modern, his voice sounding scratchy and far away. Inside the sitting room, an old lady was sleeping on the sofa, wearing a floral apron and her head rolled to one side. The sun was shining directly down onto her face, giving the skin a slightly red appearance. Mrs. Trollope leaned in through the window pane and kindly pulled the curtain across, shading the sunlight from the old woman's face and grey hair. This was not the first time she had found Mrs. Jones taking a nap before lunch. Coming out of the alley, she entered the square. The bakery bell jingled and a deep voice welcomed her in. "Afternoon, Mrs. T." "Afternoon, Mr. Jones. How are you today?" "Can't complain. The usual, is it?" "Yes, please. How's your mother?" The baker pulled a brown seed loaf out of one of the baskets and wrapped it up in brown paper. "All a-go she is. I can't keep her still. Left her washing all the windows this morning." He sighed and shrugged his large shoulders. "I told her I'd help her later, but she'll do as she does." "Of course, you have a business to run," replied Mrs. Trollope sympathetically, "and I'm sure she appreciates how hard you work." This cheered Mr. Jones up, and he broke into a wide smile as he insisted on storing the bread away into Mrs. Trollope's basket personally. "I wouldn't worry. I suspect she's getting rest when you're not looking." "I hope so," he replied. Mrs. Trollope was slipping her basket back under her arm when she spied a pile of old brown aprons sitting on the counter. They were coarse, but not canvas. A few stains were visible as well as some holes. Clearly unfit for their original purpose, they were, to her mounting delight, very usable. "Are you throwing those out?" she inquired. Mr. Jones nodded. "Aye, they're too old." He looked surprised as she made her request. "You're welcome to them, but they're not so nice." "Mr. Jones, I think these have solved a great problem I've been having." "In that case, happy to be of help, Mrs. T." He gathered them up with a quick sweep and handed the aprons over. "Does this mean a new one?" he asked in a reverent undertone as he opened the door for her. "Between you and me, yes. Your aprons will play their part," Mrs. Trollope whispered back. She left as Mr. Jones locked up his shop and headed back home for lunch, where Mrs. Jones would by now be up and busying around, her constant stream of energy forever a mystery to her son. No doubt the whole village would learn of the apron's fate by tea time. The church bell rang the hour as Mrs. Trollope returned to the post office and headed around to the side entrance and up the narrow stairs to her flat. After setting the tea on to boil and cutting a couple of thick slices of bread, she brought out the block of cheese and the last of the cucumbers from the garden. That was another sign, the final cucumber of the summer. Nibbling on a sliver of cheese, she surveyed the mess of fabrics on her dining room table. An array of small squares filled the space, shades of pumpkin, oranges, and a light cream. Placing the aprons down, she snipped out a quick square, skirting around the stains, and added it to the pile. It was perfect, the colours now harmonised. They sang of leaves turning gold, the days growing shorter, coats and scarves pulled out of the cupboards, and the lighting up of the wood fires once more. She would wear it on Sunday with her new hat. And that was how the village of Little Thatchbridge learned of the arrival of autumn that year. The end. I hope you all enjoyed the story today. This will not be the last story about Mrs. Trollope, so please consider subscribing if you'd like to see more videos. Feel free to leave a comment down below if you have any questions or you'd like to say hello. Until next time.